Hello, good evening. I'm very happy to welcome you on behalf of my father, John Train, who unfortunately is indisposed. And he wishes he was here, and he wanted to give you each and everyone a warm welcome, and thank you for coming. And a special thanks to our patrons who make this all possible, and also to the nominators, without which we wouldn't have the amazing awardees that we do. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to George Biddle, who's our vice chairman, and I hope you will find this very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Musa, and thank you everyone for coming. It is truly a shame that John is not with us tonight, because this prize was conceived by him and inspired actually by Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his struggle against tyranny and terror and the totalitarian pressures of the Soviet Union. And John conceived of it from the standpoint of thinking about the civil courage it took for Solzhenitsyn to stand up to the Soviet Union. And he designed the phrase which really epitomizes this prize, which is, it is given to someone who exhibits steadfast resistance to evil at great personal risk. And that is what this prize is about, and that is, in fact, what all the recipients have espoused and been able to show with tremendous courage over the 20 years that this prize has been given. Tonight's laureate, who we're going to talk about later, Vladimir, who's right here, who's an amazing human being. I've gotten to know him over the last few days here in New York. I will introduce a little later. I have a few other things I wanted to do before I also get to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Bill Burns. The first is there's some ground rules, because we are going to have a dialogue with Vladimir later. The conversation here tonight is on the record, but you're not allowed to disclose where the conversation occurred. So if you just want to keep our location secret, that would be great. The other thing I would like to do is just to recognize a few people who are with us in the room this evening. We had hoped that Aziz Al-Hamza, one of our laureates from 2016, who's in New York, and I don't know if you're here, Aziz, I don't think he's arrived yet, but he may slip in. He was the founder and civil journalist who founded Raqqa is Being Slaughtered Silently. It was a group of citizen journalists and reporters who reported live from the occupation of Raqqa by ISIS and other terrorist actors, and really took his life into his own hands for his own community. And he may be coming in later, and if he does, we might ask him to just take a brief bow. I also wanted to mention one of our other laureates from 2013, Dr. Denis Mukwege, who you may have recently read about as the Nobel laureate. And the nominator, Nancy Camel, is here tonight. So we're grateful to you for putting a spotlight on Dr. Mukwege before the world did. So. Lastly, we're also fortunate to have the recently retired UN High Commissioner for Human Rights with us, Zaid Rad Al-Hussein. Where is Zaid? He is truly, you talk about a courageous man who spoke truth to power. That's the gentleman right there. But now it's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker. For anyone who follows diplomacy, you'll be well aware that Ambassador Bill Burns is one of the preeminent diplomats of U.S. State Department over the last decades. Besides being ambassador to Russia and to Jordan, he has also served in numerous other roles, including as Undersecretary of State and as Deputy Secretary of State, one of only 2 career officials in the history of the Foreign Service to rise to the number 2 rank at the State Department. We're so fortunate he came from Washington tonight. He's on a little bit of a press schedule. Today, he serves as the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he's going to give us some remarks to put in context this terrific award that we're going to give to Vladimir. Ambassador Burns.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for that kind introduction, George. It's truly an honor to join all of you in highlighting the enduring purpose of the Train Foundation. It's truly an honor to be among so many people in this room for whom I have such respect. And it's a particular honor to help celebrate the bravery and remarkable example of this year's Civil Courage Prize recipient, Vladimir Kara-Murza. I can think of no one more deserving and no one who better embodies the prize's ideal of steadfast resistance to evil at great personal risk. Diplomats, especially recovering diplomats like me, have a very well-deserved reputation for being long-winded. I'll do my best to break that stereotype this evening. Whenever I think of the value of brevity in public speaking, I'm reminded of a story that involved the famous author George Bernard Shaw. It seems that Shaw was hosting an event in London one day, and the featured speaker came up to him and asked how long he should speak for. Shaw told him he should probably limit his remarks to about 10 minutes. The speaker looked at him in horror and said, 10 minutes? How am I supposed to tell them everything I know in 10 minutes? Shaw paused and replied, in your case, my advice would be to speak very slowly. In my case, you don't have to worry about me going beyond 10 minutes, even if I speak very slowly. My message this evening is simple and sober. There has never been a moment when civil courage, so brilliantly exemplified by Vladimir Karamurza, mattered more in our world than it does today. This is a moment when authoritarians feel the wind in their sails, and democracies, including my own, are adrift and losing their way. This is a moment when the practiced repressive habits of autocrats seem ascendant, and the institutions which guard freedom and dignity are being hollowed out in too many ways in too many societies. And this is a moment when civil courage can seem an endangered species. With civil society embattled in autocracies of one stripe or another, and individual citizens in democratic systems trapped by fatalism and tribalism and battered by rising inequalities and the endless cacophony of identity politics. Around the world, walls are coming up faster than they are coming down. The politics of fear is drowning out the politics of hope. As all of you know, this is not an entirely new phenomenon. I've seen these corrosive trends building over the course of my checkered career as a diplomat. I saw them in Russia, as the curious mix of hope and uncertainty that I experienced during my first tour in Moscow in the early 1990s gave way to the combustible combination of smoldering grievance, preening ambition, and cold-blooded repression that emerged in Vladimir Putin's Russia during my second tour as ambassador more than a decade ago. I remember vividly speaking at the funeral of Anna Politkovskaya shortly after her murder in 2006, only a year after she had received the Civil Courage Prize for her fearless reporting on Chechnya. It was a cold, late autumn afternoon in Moscow, with a few snowflakes falling as dusk settled, and long lines of mourners shuffling slowly toward the hall where her casket lay. Not a single senior Russian official showed up. So it fell to a couple of Anna's courageous editors at Novaya Gazeta and me to try to honor her memory and emphasize the significance of her life and her work. Nothing drove home to me more powerfully the callousness and oppressive bent of the Putin era than that bleak day. Putin made crystal clear where he stood, and it was important for the United States to make clear where we stood. We could not afford to ignore our interests in Russia or forsake efforts to manage what was fast becoming an adversarial relationship. We definitely could not afford to give in to Putin's aggression. And we certainly could not afford to give up on the Russia that lay beyond Putin and that lies beyond Putin today. A Russia full of people proud of their complicated history, with no shortage of insecurities and challenges, but intent upon realizing their full human potential and dignity. I also saw those difficult trends unfolding in the Middle East through various professional incarnations over the past 35 years. I stood in Tahrir Square in Cairo in February of 2011, a week after Hosni Mubarak had been overthrown. It was impossible not to feel the sense of possibility that surged through Arab societies that spring, as decades of dysfunction and indignity seemed to be giving way to a more hopeful and a more open future. But it didn't take long for the forces of counter-revolution to gain momentum and for that euphoric moment to fade. Peaceful popular uprisings gave way to a brutish civil war in Syria, bloody chaos in Libya, and a still worsening human catastrophe in Yemen. With growing impunity, Arab autocrats, often indulged by the United States and other foreign backers, have sought to stamp out rumblings of criticism and free expression. Like Anna Politkovskaya, Jamal Khashoggi was a stubbornly independent journalist, committed to realizing the best of which his country was capable, and unafraid to speak truth to power. His abduction and apparent murder in Istanbul in a Saudi diplomatic facility, reportedly at the direction of the Saudi leadership, is a horrific act. It demands that my government and others around the world offer strong condemnation and tangible consequences, not the tacit encouragement for overreach that has bred such horrendous conditions in Yemen and led to the awful fate of Jamal Khashoggi. It has always been an illusion, in my view, to think that stability is a static phenomenon, that strong men and their closed political systems provide a prescription for sustainable societies. They eventually become brittle and break, and they invariably become less reliable partners. Failing to understand the deeper drivers of change in the Middle East or in any other part of the world is a persistent weakness of American foreign policy. The United States is hardly immune to those same troubling trends. President Trump did not invent the dysfunctions of our own society, the mounting sense of inequality of wealth and opportunity, the anxiety and frustration of people who feel their role and cultural identity is eroding, the wave of anger from citizens whose boats haven't been lifted by globalization, even as many of the architects of the 2008 financial crisis quickly righted themselves. The disconnect between wide swaths of the population who question American leadership after the costly and undisciplined military adventures of the post-9/11 era, and a Washington establishment that continues to preach the virtues of global engagement without acknowledging the mistakes we've made. But I fear that this administration is making all these troubles much, much worse. Untethered to history or experience, the president has stirred a nasty brew of muscular unilateralism, mercantilism, and transactionalism. His is a diplomacy of narcissism and narrow deal-making, not of institutions and alliances, the strengths which set us apart from lonelier powers like Russia and China. His is a rhetoric of mean spirit and division, of attacks on journalists as enemies of the people and on public servants as a hostile deep state. That can only inhibit freedom of expression, undermine truth, and alienate citizens from their own governments. Many years of representing my country abroad have taught me that it is the power of our example, more than the power of our preaching, which can amplify all the other sources of military, economic, and political influence. Sadly, we are rapidly corroding that image, the idea of America that is so often proven, despite all our imperfections and failings, to be one of our most potent sources of power. However much they may resent particular American policies, people around the world are drawn to the idea of America, to a place of possibility and mobility and openness, where the rule of law protects the less fortunate and preserves hope. What people see today, all too often, is polarization and incivility and policy gridlock, images of immigrant children separated from their families, crumbling infrastructure, and fact-free public discourse. In the Trump era, values have receded rapidly in the American foreign policy calculus. Human rights seem an afterthought, their significance discounted, sometimes used as a tool against dictatorial adversaries, but often ignored in the case of dictatorial partners we prefer to indulge. I would be the last person to argue that our record in previous administrations has been pristine in this regard. I've made my own share of mistakes in prioritizing practical near-term interests over full-throated defense of human rights. In administrations of both parties that I've served, we've often gotten the balance wrong. But I've never witnessed the kind of conscious, unapologetic disregard for human rights concerns that seems to be the norm so far in this administration. My point is that that is not only morally indefensible, but practically counterproductive, undercutting our own strategic interests over the long term. So what lesson should we draw from this depressing landscape? I know I'm perilously close to violating George Bernard Shaw's 10-minute rule for brevity in public speaking, so let me just offer two. The first is about American policy. The sooner we realize the foolishness of a strategy devoid of values and reverse it, the better. We will not always get the balance right, and we will inevitably produce disappointments and make unappealing trade-offs. But the willful Hobbesian dismissiveness of this administration toward many human rights concerns will only undercut our interests and make our policies nasty, brutish, and short-sighted. At its best, American foreign policy has been animated by a sense of enlightened self-interest, in which we see a wider purpose to enlarging the circle of countries and societies which share our values and interests, and have a common stake in just, workable international rules of the road. What we've seen over the past couple of years is much more about the self part than the enlightened, and that is an historic mistake. The second lesson returns us to the profound importance of civil courage in any society, democratic or authoritarian or somewhere in between. Without brave individuals like Anna Politkovskaya or Jamal Khashoggi, without courageous exemplars like Vladimir Kara-Murza, societies wither and drift. Their fearlessness should give us the hope and courage to stand up for justice and address the flaws and challenges of our countries and our world. Authoritarians traffic in fear, and depriving them of that weapon is our surest path to a better future. We all owe an enormous debt to those who show us the way at grave personal risk, and we honor them not only by awards like this one, but by how we live their examples. Thank you.
Now you know exactly why he is America's preeminent diplomat of his generation. That obviously set the stage for the conversation we're going to have with Vladimir. We can't thank you enough, honestly. Ambassador Burns did squeeze us into a very tight schedule and came down from Washington, so we are grateful for those remarks. Thank you so much. I want to make one footnote about how the evening will proceed from here. We're also fortunate to have with us tonight Ambassador Jeremy Greenstock, who's an advisor to the Civil Courage Prize. For those of you who don't know Ambassador Greenstock, he is also one of Britain's most preeminent diplomats, having served as ambassador to the United Nations and in a unique role in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq as the minister for Britain working with the United States on the ground in Iraq in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion in the 2003 to 2005 period, as I recall. I've known Jeremy for a while as well. Sir Jeremy, he's also a wonderful advocate for refugees, which is a passion of mine, and we serve together on the board of the International Rescue Committee in Britain, and we're thrilled that he's with us tonight as well from London. After I introduce our laureate, Ambassador Greenstock, Sir Jeremy will have a conversation with Vladimir to try and flesh out some of the issues that we're all thinking about, and then we will open it up to a conversation with all of you as well. So now it is my privilege to introduce our laureate. He's a remarkable man. Maybe a couple of just basic biographical details. He holds both an undergraduate and a graduate degree from Cambridge University in England. He's a journalist, he's a filmmaker, he's an intellectual. He's quite a remarkable young man. And he has also led a fight in his country at tremendous personal risk to bring an open and democratic society to the front. to the fore, to bring it into the consciousness of the Russian people. And as you know, that in Russia today, that is a very scary undertaking. His partner, as the vice chair of the Open Russia Foundation, or Open Russia, I guess it's officially called, which has been striving as a civil society organization to achieve these goals, was Boris Nemtsov. For those of you who follow Russian politics, you'll know that Mr. Nemtsov was the leading opposition figure in Russia who was gunned down on a bridge within sight of the Kremlin in 2015. Vladimir kept the mantle of Open Russia going, continuing to travel across the country to promote his beliefs and Boris's and many other people in Russia, and he was poisoned in 2015. He landed in a coma, and the doctor said he had 5% chance to survive. He did, and he did not back down. And he continued to fight for what he believed in, traveling across the country. And as he told us, meeting with young people, there is sometimes a belief that Russia, because of its history, there isn't a yearning for freedom, democracy, and a civil society that would make the Russian people proud. But he will tell you tonight that as he travels in all parts of Russia, that he is meeting young people with a yearning for that. He continued his work, and in 2017, he was poisoned again. He nearly died. He was in a coma again, and the doctors were extremely worried. I asked Vladimir the other day, I said, "How is your body today?" And he said, "I'm okay. I can think, and that's what's important, but it's weaker." He has taken on a tremendous toll on behalf of his country. He epitomizes steadfast resistance to evil at great personal risk. And one person in the United States who really recognized that most recently was the late Senator John McCain, who became both an admirer and a friend of Vladimir's. He asked Vladimir to be a pallbearer at his funeral, the only non-American to be so honored recently, if any of you watched it on television. I can't think of anyone who we should honor more with the Civil Courage Prize than Vladimir Morza, Kara-Murza. We are so happy you're here. We are grateful for your courage and the example you show. And I'd like to invite you up to receive the prize formally from Nina Train, John's daughter, who's here to present it to you. Please come up. Push this back for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Biddle, for that overly kind and actually very embarrassing introduction. But I would like, first of all, to thank the chairman of the foundation, the Honorable John Train, George Biddle, the co-chairman, and the trustees and the officers of the Train Foundation for this deeply humbling recognition. And I have to say that it is a special honor to receive this prize from an organization whose founding patron was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, not only one of Russia's greatest writers, but also one of Russia's greatest citizens. A man who showed with his whole life that even in the darkest days of despotism and oppression, it is still possible to keep one's dignity, to keep one's truth, and to keep one's soul. And that, to use Solzhenitsyn's own metaphor, a determined enough calf can overcome the most entrenched oak tree.